Welcome back. Today we're up to Chapter 5 in Sandel's Justice, What's the Right Thing to Do? Today we're talking about 18th century German philosopher Immanuel Kant. We first heard about Dr. Kant when we were reading Solomon's book in his chapter on morality, but that was just a very brief discussion of Kant then. So now we're going to take a much deeper dive into his content and such. And we're going to frame the discussion according to four distinctions in four areas that Sandel helpfully provides. Those areas are freedom, standpoints, reason, and morality. We're also going to talk about the difference between telling an outright lie and telling a misleading truth, and also a bit about Kant's political philosophy, which will be a really nice lead into next week's discussion of John Rawls. So first of all, we've got freedom, and here we've got a distinction between autonomy and heteronomy. And to do things from an autonomous perspective means to do them according to a way that no one else coerces us, according to no outside forces. In this case, it's according to a self-authored law. To do things in a heteronomous fashion means to do them according to some external force. And here we're talking about instinct or desire. We're doing things because they make us happy or because our body or nature just tells us to do them. And of course, Kant wants us to do the former. We probably want to do the former as well. We want to do things in an autonomous fashion. And so when can we carry out autonomous actions? Well, we can do those specifically in the realm of thought. And so here we come down to the distinction between the intelligible versus the sensible realms. And it's here in the intelligible realm that we're actually able to carry out these self-authored laws and be free and be autonomous. Whereas over here on the sensible realm side, according to the empirical world and the physical things that are around us, which are of course bound by the biological, chemical, and physical laws around us, we can't be free in that realm. But luckily, we can think in a free way when we're acting according to a self-authored law. Now, recognize that this is a little bit confusing, I know, but just hang with me. It'll get a little bit clearer as I move through these different distinctions. All right, so we went from autonomous versus heteronomous to intelligible versus sensible. Now we're coming on down to categorical versus hypothetical imperatives. Fancy terms, I know, but they're not that complex. A hypothetical imperative is simply an imperative that's conditioned on aims, your current purposes. It just means if I want Y, I should do X. That's all it means. That's all hypothetical imperative means. For example, if I want to make a good grade in maths class, I should read the book firsthand myself and take notes and study it. If I want to make $1 million, I should, I don't know how you make $1 million, rob a bank, I suppose. You should do more than just sit on the couch and watch television all day. If I want to lose weight, I should exercise and eat less food. If I want my muscle mass to increase, I should eat protein and lift weights. If you want to achieve Y, you should do X. A categorical imperative, on the other hand, that's something that you have to do regardless of your current aims. It applies in all cases and all situations. So a hypothetical imperative, that's something that you only do when you have a particular aim. A categorical imperative, that's something you have to always do. Now, what might be a categorical imperative? Well, the categorical imperative has two components, and these make up the core of Kant's ethics. The first formulation of the categorical imperative is, in maths terms, only do stuff you could universalize. Only do things that you could will to become a universal law for persons to always do in similar situations. And we discussed this in the discussion of Kantian ethics in the Solomon book. I'll give you the same example again, lying. If I'm tempted to tell a lie, I should ask myself, what if people were to always lie when it was to their advantage? What would be the implication of that? Implication would be if everyone always lied, no one would believe anyone. And so the advantage that you seek by lying would not be there because no one would believe you when you attempted to lie. It's the similar truth is there when you're talking about theft. If I'm tempted to steal, I have to ask myself, what if people always stole? Well, if people always stole, then someone would steal from me what I stole from someone else. Further, the economy would break down, there wouldn't be anything to steal, etc., etc. So you can only do things that you can universalize, that you could formulate into some sort of a law and say, everyone always do this in similar circumstances. If it can't pass that test, you ought not do it. It's unethical to do it. It doesn't pass the categorical imperatives universalization test. Now, it's important to note that this is not the golden rule. The golden rule is an excellent ethical rule. It's one that I attempt to practice myself and that I encourage my family to practice. But there's a distinction between the categorical imperative, the first formulation, which is the universalization of the maxim that you're attempting to act on, and the golden rule, which is treat others the way you would like to be treated. The difference is the golden rule is based on your personal perspective and your personal tastes. And so, for example, if my wife were to ask me, Matt, how do I look in this dress? If I'm practicing the golden rule, I might ask myself, well, what if I were wearing that dress, or just if I were dressed up? What do I want someone to tell me regardless of the way I actually looked? Well, I'd probably want them to tell me that I look nice. That way I'd feel confident about myself and I would enjoy the evening or whatever I'm going to do, regardless of the way that I actually looked. And that would be consistent with the golden rule, asking myself, what would I prefer, and then acting on that. But the categorical imperative asks me, well, what if people always told little white lies in that sort of a situation? Well, if people always lied in that sort of a situation, my wife wouldn't ask me what she looked like to begin with. And so I'm attempting to tell her a little white lie to make her feel good. I have benevolent motivations, but if everyone did that in that circumstance, it wouldn't do me any good. It wouldn't do her any good either. And so it doesn't pass the universalizability test. So just a quick note, people often get confused about categorical imperative and the golden rule. Both very admirable ethical maxims, but very laudable ethical rules, but not the same thing, slightly different. The second formulation of the categorical imperative is that we ought not treat persons as mere tools. We always should treat humanity as an end in itself and never as a mere tool. An end in itself. Well, up here when you're talking about the hypothetical imperatives, if I want Y, I should do X. Y is the end. That's the thing that you're trying to get. X is the means to that end. We should always treat human beings, because they're rational just like we are, and they're capable of following the categorical imperative and being autonomous creatures. We should treat them with the same level of respect that we ourselves deserve as autonomous creatures capable of practicing the categorical imperative. Kant argued that's what gives human beings intrinsic worth and infinite value, the fact that we're able to do that. That distinguishes us from beasts and the rest of the animal kingdom and the rest of existence pretty much. And so, since that's the case, it's okay to treat tools as tools, but not persons. And this maxim applies to others, and it also applies to ourselves. And so how it applies to others is that we ought not murder other persons, because, hey, they're rational, autonomous creatures like we are, and so they deserve to not be murdered. But it also means we can't commit suicide. If we were to be in terrible pain, either psychological or physical pain, we'd be tempted to just end it all. Well, Kant would say that if you were to do this, you're treating your pain and suffering as the end and not yourself, and so you're using yourself as a means to the end of alleviating the pain and suffering. And so you're not respecting the humanity within yourself by killing yourself. Now, you can buy that argument or not, but that's the argument he makes against suicide, and a lot of people have found it quite compelling. All right, last, this is going to bring us down from categorical to hypothetical reasons, imperatives, all the way down to morality. And so to do something in a way that's morally praiseworthy is to do it out of a sense of duty. And that sense of duty has to be tied back to fidelity to the categorical imperative. If you do something because you're inclined to do it, because it feels good, well, that's not morally praiseworthy. It's just out of a base desire. And Kant would say that that's degrading, it's animalistic. Instead, you should do things because you're motivated out of a sense of duty. And not just a sense of duty to do what you think you should do, but to do whatever the categorical imperative demands. So we've worked our way through the autonomy versus heteronomy distinction, the intelligible versus the sensible distinction, the categorical versus the hypothetical imperatives distinction, and now we're all the way down to duty versus inclination. Notice the concepts on the left align with what Kant's after, the concepts on the right align with what he would discourage, or it's just the opposite of what he's arguing for. Okay, now we're going to talk about whether or not there's a difference between telling an outright lie, or a moral difference between telling an outright lie, and a misleading truth. And as you can see here on my notes, this is going to pit Kant and Clinton and Sandel against me, because Kant and Clinton think that it's okay, apparently they think it's okay to tell a misleading truth, but not okay to tell an outright lie. But I think if you were to tell a misleading truth, that also fails according to the categorical imperative. But hey, I'm disagreeing with Kant himself, which is pretty tough to do. Kant himself was asked by the King of Prussia to stop writing religious writings, to stop publishing things of religion. He thought it was he thought Kant's writings were contrary to Christianity, and so, which many people disagree about that, but at the time apparently Kant was saying some things that were contrary to the church, or at least the Prussian king's interpretation of what the church promotes. In any case, Kant said, "I promise, sir, to not give any public lectures or publish any writings on religion as long as I am your loyal subject," or something to that effect, knowing full well that the king would die soon. King dies 2 years later, and Kant brags, "Well, the way I worded my promise, I'm fully released from it now." And so he said pretty much that he tended to give himself this out. And the way he said this, the way he worded it, the king may have interpreted it as if Kant were promising to never write about or speak about religion ever again, but Kant would say, well, no, the way that you can interpret this is that I just promised to not write or speak about religion so long as I'm his subject. He's the king, and so now I'm released from it. I can do whatever I want in that regard. Bill Clinton, if you're old enough to remember the Monica Lewinsky scandal, came on television, pointed at the camera and said, I want the American people to know I did not have sexual relations with that woman. And when it was later discovered that he did, in fact, have a relationship with a woman, his attorney argued in some congressional hearings that President Clinton did not lie because the way that he interprets the word sex, it does not apply to oral sex. And so since they never engaged in classical intercourse, I suppose you would call it, Clinton didn't lie. Now, his attorney agreed that Clinton was misleading, but he never agreed that he lied, never conceded to that. Sandel tries to defend Kant. He tries to defend Clinton's lawyer apparently, and I guess Sandel thinks that it's okay to tell a misleading truth, and he thinks that it passes the categorical imperative because you could universalize the maxim that people say things that in a weaselly way, answer questions in a weaselly way, because if everyone always did that, the only result would be that people would listen more closely as if an attorney would listen. But I think that you can't universalize it because if that were the response, then no one would be able to take anyone at their word. They would always have to challenge the interpretation of their words. They would always have to continually prod them and interrogate them and try to get to the bottom of what's actually the facts of the matter. I think that this isn't consistent. I think telling a misleading truth isn't consistent with treating humanity as an end and ever as a mere tool. And it sounds like you're just trying to escape a person's wrath. You just want to get around the fact that the king doesn't want you to publish or speak about religion again. You're just trying to avoid the scandal that was the Monica Lewinsky mess. And you want the public to believe that you didn't do anything at all with this woman. And you want the king to believe that you're never going to say or publish anything about religion ever again. Although you know in the back of your mind you did something inappropriate that was indeed very sexual. And you know in the back of your mind, as soon as the king dies, I'm going to go out and write some more. So this pits little old Matt Deaton against the great Immanuel Kant and Bill Clinton's attorneys and Michael Sandel as well, apparently, because he's trying to defend this perspective. That's going to be one of your discussion questions, as you'll see in just a moment, but there's something to think about. All right, last, Kant's political philosophy. Two components of Kant's political philosophy that are discussed in the book. First, he thinks that there should be a regime of rights that can harmonize the freedom of all persons. So you've got a world in which you've got people that are autonomous and they're going to be conducting themselves in this intelligible world. They're going to be acting according to categorical imperatives out of a sense of duty. We need a rights regime, which just means something perhaps similar to, perhaps not in content, but in structure, similar to the United States Bill of Rights, freedom of press, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, maybe equal protection under the law. I'm not sure what it would look like, but Kant thinks that we're going to need that. Second component of Kant's political philosophy, he argues for an idealized social contract and not an actual historical social contract, as many political philosophers before him had argued for. And so a social contract classically is just where you say that, okay, people at one point were in a state of nature. They were living in anarchy, living in the woods, living in the jungle, and they decided to come together and form a society and build cities and have some people out in the rural areas grow crops and sell them and have an economy, etc., etc. That they had this explicit agreement at some point. And the fact that they did that gives the state some authority to coerce its citizens and to jail criminals and to pass laws, etc., etc. Well, Kant argued that there's no reason to try to pinpoint the time in history when that actually occurred. And in fact, it's probably better that it didn't occur because people are prone to make mistakes and they're prone to agree to things they probably shouldn't agree to. But if we instead think, what would be a social contract that anyone could agree to? What would be a constitution, for example, the meta law that governs all subsequent laws after it and beneath it? What could they agree to? And that's what we should think about when we're discussing what should be in our constitution, what would be the content of our laws. What are the laws anyone could agree to? And so here are your two discussion questions for this week. That's Kant, lots of fun stuff, right? Here are your two discussion questions. Number one, what about this distinction between telling an outright lie and telling a misleading truth? Kant and Clinton thought that there was a meaningful distinction, and I'm really surprised that Kant would do this sort of thing. Knowing as much as I do about Kant, I can't believe that I haven't read this about him before already, but I was surprised to read this in the way that I did by Sandel. And I'm surprised that Kant thought that this was okay according to the categorical imperative. I'm not surprised that Bill Clinton would do something like that, but I am surprised that Kant would do it and endorse it, etc. But what do you think? Can you universalize telling a misleading truth? Is that contrary to the categorical imperative? And so we're trying to judge. We're not asking, is it ethical, unethical, based on our own standards, based on society standards, whatever. The question is it consistent with the categorical imperative? We're going to use Kant's own theory to judge his interpretation of his ethical theory. Could you universalize this in the way that Sandel suggests? I don't think you could. I don't think you could maintain the advantage that you seek. But please think through this on your own. I don't want you to agree with me just because I'm the teacher. You know that I'm not a hard grader on these discussion posts. Last question is, what about this idealized social contract and this regime of rights? What would that look like? Say if we're going to start over today and we're going to write a new constitution for the United States. Say we could do that. If we could, and we're following Kant's political philosophy, we're trying to think, what's a regime of rights? What are a list of basic rights for the citizens that would enable all these different people to pursue whatever they'd like to pursue, to exercise their freedom? And what could those basic rights be? What would those basic rights be if everyone had to agree to them? So we're asking ourselves, hypothetically, start over the Constitution. Found it again. We're the new founders, me and you. What's going to be the content of that Constitution? We're trying to think through it in that way. What are the rights that we can put in that Constitution that everyone could agree to? Thanks as always for your attention. Hope you've enjoyed this, and I look forward to your posts.